Today we're going to talk about ecological succession. The goal of this video is to explain the process and starting conditions of primary and secondary succession. So, what is ecological succession? Ecological succession is the process of ecological change in an ecosystem where one community gets replaced by another community over time. There are two types of ecological succession. The first is called primary succession. Primary succession results in a brand new ecosystem. The second is called secondary succession. Secondary succession recovers an old ecosystem. For the remainder of this video, we'll explore each type of succession in more depth. Starting with primary succession. Primary succession occurs when a community forms in an area that has not been previously occupied. Examples of areas like this include exposed rock on the side of a cliff, hardened rock formed after lava cools, and eroded sand. This is very important. In all three cases, there is no topsoil for plants to grow in. So, how is this topsoil formed? This occurs over a long period of time through the work of what are called pioneer species. Pioneer species are the first organisms to grow in a new environment. For example, lichens and mosses. I have a picture of each on this slide. These organisms can grow in areas where others cannot, and over time, these organisms decompose and release nutrients to form a layer of soil that larger, more complex plants can grow in. Once enough soil has been generated to retain nutrients, then small plants, flowers, ferns, and shrubs can begin to grow. These plants further break down the rock, allowing even more soil to be formed and retained. The seeds from other plants and even trees become able to grow, and over time, large plants become able to inhabit the area. As new species of plant move in, new animal species become able to inhabit the area. And eventually, a mature community results in which there is little change in the composition of species, the species that compose that community. A climax community is a mature and stable community of plants and animals. This is reached towards the end of succession. Now let's finish up by talking about secondary succession. Secondary succession occurs in an area that was previously occupied by living organisms, but the community was destroyed by some kind of disturbance. Examples of such a disturbance would be a forest fire, a hurricane, or even farming. Even though the established community is destroyed in the event of such a disturbance, the soil is still intact. That's a major difference between primary and secondary succession. And because the soil is still intact, it takes less time for secondary succession to occur compared to the time it takes for primary succession to occur. The pioneer species for secondary succession are weeds and grasses. Those weeds and grasses are able to grow quickly, and the process continues much like primary succession until the climax community is reached. Now, I just described how ecosystems can form and change over time, and ecosystems are always changing. But that doesn't mean they're unstable. A stable ecosystem is one that remains relatively constant with predictable changes. When it does change, these types of changes are to be expected. Now, I'm going to summarize this video in a single chart. There are two types of succession: primary succession and secondary succession. Primary succession builds a brand new ecosystem from scratch, starting with no soil. An analogy would be like baking cookies from scratch, starting with flour, butter, sugar, and so on. An example of primary succession would be a volcano eruption or a glacier melting. In both cases, just bare rock is left exposed. In primary succession, the pioneer species are mosses and lichens because they can make soil. And the result of primary succession is a mature and stable climax community. Secondary succession recovers a previously existing ecosystem after some kind of disturbance. In this case, there is still soil present, so you don't have to start from scratch. An analogy would be like baking cookies with pre-made dough. An example of secondary succession would be forest fires, hurricanes, and even farming. The pioneer species of secondary succession are primarily weeds and grasses, and the result of secondary succession is a mature and stable climax community.